Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Andrew Quintman, Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Yale University. Professor Quintman specializes in the Buddhist traditions of Tibet and the Himalaya. His areas of teaching and research include Buddhist literature and history, sacred geography and pilgrimage, and visual cultures of the wider Himalayan region. He is also interested in the religious and literary histories of Tibet's unique southern border communities. Today we talk with Professor Quintman about his book, The Yogin and the Madman, reading the biographical corpus of Tibet's great saint Milarepa. Welcome, Professor Quintman.
Thank you. Such a pleasure to be here.
Let's begin with your book. Give us an overview.
Sure. Well, The Yogin and the Madman, in essence, is a literary history of what I think you could call Tibet's most famous book. It's the story of a famous 11th century meditator and poet and kind of wandering mendicant. His name was Milarepa, and so his name, Repa, the Repa in Milarepa, refers to the white cotton robe that he would wear even in the dead of winter in the high Himalayan mountains. And it's the story of his early childhood, where he became famous as a kind of mass murderer for killing dozens of people in his own family. Eventually goes on to repent the great crimes of his youth, goes on to practice with a Buddhist teacher, spends the rest of his life in the high Himalayan mountains, living in mountain caves and on rock cliffs, with nothing but his white cotton robe, and then goes on to become a great Buddhist teacher and poet.
Okay, and what time period again are we talking about?
So he's in the 11th century.
Okay, so did he actually really exist?
Well, we don't know a lot about him historically, and in fact one of the points that I make in the book is that the search for the historical Milarepa in some ways might parallel the search for the historical Jesus, but at least in the context of this figure, it's not the most interesting or important question to ask. What I'm really interested in is the way in which the figure of Milarepa went on to become the paradigm for the great religious practitioner, not only in Tibet, but across the Himalayan world.
Okay, and just to clarify, Milarepa is the Yogin and the Madman?
So Milarepa is the Yogin, and the Madman refers to the author of his most famous biography, which was written in the 15th century, 400 years after he died. And so the book, in a sense, tracks the development of the biographical tradition of Milarepa, beginning in the 11th century, with some fragmentary stories written by his own disciples, but culminates in the classical, canonical version written in the 15th century by this figure who referred to himself as the Madman, a really interesting figure called the Madman from Western Tibet.
Okay, and talk a little bit about this Madman. Why did he refer to himself as?
Sure, well, he lived in the 15th century, and he wrote this version, the standard classical version of the life of Milarepa in 1488. And he was part of a growing movement that we can think about as a form of kind of religious madness. They referred to themselves as religious madmen. And in part, this was, I think, a response to the kind of rampant institutionalization of Buddhism at the time, where Buddhist monasteries were often formed around a charismatic teacher who was a recognized reincarnation. In Tibetan, we call them tulkus. Monasteries had developed a tremendous amount of political and secular power, tremendous kind of economic base in addition to their religious responsibilities. And in a sense, the idea of the religious madman harkens back to this early tradition, going back to medieval India, in which you have the figure of the kind of solitary wandering yogi who imagines him or herself as somehow being freed from the traditional kind of social norms or ethical boundaries of religious practice. So much of their practice was based on the idea of transgression. So in ancient India, it was drinking alcohol and taking up kind of sexual practices, especially with low caste women or prostitutes or things like that, things that were understood as being really transgressive. And so fast forward to the 15th century in Tibet, and you have this group of people who were modeling themselves on that kind of transgressive behavior. And so the madman in the Yogin and the Madman then is exactly this kind of figure. He's said to have spent many years meditating in the border jungles of Tibet and northeast India. He came out of retreat in the jungle with nothing but a loincloth, and he had the severed fingers and toes of human corpses around his hair, and wearing garlands made from human intestines and eating kind of the brains of rotten corpses to show that he was somehow beyond the kind of dualistic fixations on what was pure and what was impure. And this kind of figure held a tremendous amount of power in the religious traditions of the Himalaya, so through the fact of their transgression.
And what led you to write this book?
Well, in part, it's because the characters, both the Yogin and the Madman, are so compelling. It was a story that I first came into contact with more than 25 years ago when I was first studying in northern Nepal. I was actually researching some of the mountain caves and retreats associated with Milarepa. And I was really struck by the kind of emotional power, the real pathos in the story that describes Milarepa's life. And that really stuck with me, and I eventually became interested in understanding the kind of literary history that led to the development of this story. And that turned me to looking at some of the earliest sources that led up to the creation of the canonical version.
Okay, and how did you do the research? Let's talk about that a little bit more.
Sure. Well, the research is largely kind of textual in nature. So one of the real problems was trying to get access to this incredible body of literature. One of the things that makes this such an interesting topic, a kind of literary study, is that there's an enormous body of literature about the figure Milarepa that goes back to right around the time of his death in the 11th century, in the early 12th century. So a very small percentage of that material has been published, but many of those texts exist only as kind of single, rare copies of in manuscript form. So it was kind of seeking out the archives where those texts exist.
And where are they?
Well, some are in Tibet, in Lhasa, some are in Nepal, some were in the National Archives of Nepal, which luckily have been microfilmed, so they're not so difficult to get access to. Some are in museum collections around the world, and I spent a lot of time sort of traveling to all of those places.
Oh, very nice. And what are they mostly written in? What language?
They're written in classical Tibetan.
Okay. I see. Okay. So, what are some of your findings in the book?
Sure. Well, one of the most interesting features of the book, and one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, was to show this kind of interesting relationship between the subject Milarepa and the author of his most famous version, Songtsen Heruka, or the Madman from Western Tibet. And so in a sense, the story of the book is the story of this unfolding relationship between the biographer and his biographical subject.
Now, were they alive at the same time?
No,
or they okay, go ahead.
They were separated by almost 400 years.
Okay. All right.
And yet, what's so interesting about the story, and I think one of the reasons why the story held such appeal, not only in Tibet and the Himalayan world, but also in the West, when it was first translated beginning in the 19th and early 20th century, is that the Madman as author not only was a tremendous kind of literateur and editor, so he was incredibly savvy in terms of his literary skills, but he also, by means of certain forms of kind of Buddhist ideas, actually projected himself into his own story. So it turns out that he recognized himself as a re-embodiment of Milarepa. And so we can read his biography of Milarepa almost as his own autobiography. So in a sense, something like the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, right, which Gertrude Stein famously wrote her own memoir as if it was a projected biography in the voice of her lover.
Okay. So any other findings?
Well, I mean, we find that the biographical corpus of Milarepa is one of the largest and most important in the entire Tibetan Buddhist world. I think it's not an exaggeration to call this the most important narrative or the most important book in the Tibetan Buddhist world, not only in Tibet, but in parts of North India and Nepal and Bhutan and Mongolia, parts of China. It really had tremendous purchase. And in that purchase, it also had a dramatic effect on the way that religious institutions developed, on the way that religious traditions were transmitted, on the way that sacred geography was defined, the way the landscape was actually defined in terms of kind of pilgrimage sites.
I see, okay. And did you have any surprises along the way in doing the research, anything you didn't perhaps expect to find?
Yeah, well, I think one of the most interesting was that, so in the most famous telling of Milarepa's life, comes to its culmination in his death. And at his death, he is cremated like a traditional Buddhist saint, like is modeled after the Buddha, and the Buddha himself was cremated. And yet after his cremation, his disciples go to look for the physical relics. So relics are very deeply important in the Buddhist tradition. And they find that all of his physical relics had been sort of swept away by these kind of celestial goddesses, and they're left with nothing. And they're deeply disturbed at this. And one of the ways that I begin to think about this story, the life of Milarepa as it developed over time, is that it's a kind of recreation of those physical relics. So you can almost imagine the beginning of his biographical tradition at the moment of his death, where there are no relics. And the unfolding of his life story is a kind of recreation of a human form. So one of the metaphors of the book that I adopt is reading the literary corpus as a kind of physical corpse. So in the early stages, they're kind of skeletal sort of fragments. Over time, that skeleton, the kind of armature, is fleshed out through more detailed and elaborate narratives. And finally, in the voice of the great Madman 4 centuries later, that sort of representation of Milarepa is breathed into life.
Right.
And that liveliness is the humanity of the story, is the kind of power that it has throughout the Buddhist world.
Right, that's an interesting analogy. And then conclusions. How do you end the book?
Well, I think that the story of Milarepa and the book, The Yogin and the Madman, tells us a number of things. I think, one, it shows just how important this story was for Tibetans and for Buddhists across the Himalayan world. And not only for Tibetans, it was also the first book that was translated, the first complete book that was translated into European languages, first into French and then into English. And it was one of the first lenses into the religious worlds of the Himalayas that scholars used at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries.
So it's still very important today.
Oh, it's still very important, and it still is a story which is told and recreated in the lives of Buddhist practitioners in Asia, and it's still a story which is now taught in religious studies classrooms across North America. And so I think that leads to the second conclusion of the book, is that it shows that the literary endeavors of people of the Himalayas, I think, can stand on the world stage of world literature alongside the other great examples of literature. I'm really delighted that my translation of the life of Milarepa was published a few years ago with Penguin Classics, and so it's now a kind of world classic like other world classics, and in fact Penguin Classics has now taken on 2 more Tibetan texts that will be part of a series of Tibetan works.
Wonderful.
So I think it shows that the Himalayan world has a literature to offer the rest of the world. I think the book also shows us the wide effects that literature can have outside of the literary world in the Himalayas. So it had a dramatic effect on the creation of religious institutions, on the transmission of Buddhist teachings, on the creation of sacred geography and pilgrimage, and things like that. And then finally, I think it raises some interesting methodological questions about how to go about studying the literature of the Himalayas. I think first it shows that we really know very little about Tibetan literature. I mean, we have access to and have studied only a very small percentage of the total sum of Tibetan literature that's available. So there's a lot of work left to do.
And why do you think only that a very small percentage has been?
Yeah, well, some of that has to do with access.
Okay.
So we've only really had access to much of this work since 1959 with the exodus of Tibetan refugees into exile into India, and those texts were then copied and printed and disseminated to the West. And now there's a lot of publication that's going on inside Tibet itself. But we still have some important archives with thousands upon thousands of rare texts that no one has access to, or virtually no one has access to. But I think it also raises questions about how we go about studying a literary tradition in the Tibetan or Buddhist world. That we not only need to read widely across a genre, but we also need to read deeply. So one of the things I tried to do was find every available source about this figure, reading from the earliest sources all the way to the kind of canonical version 400 years later, and then at more modern adaptations as well. So I think it shows that we need not only breadth, but also depth.
Yes, okay. Well, this has been very interesting. Thank you so much for being here today with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
For more information about Professor Quintman and his research, please visit our website at yale.edu/MacMillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.